Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about romance. This is a story about how humanity's oldest obsession, the pursuit of desire, drove empires to war, poisoned kings, and pushed endangered species to the brink of extinction. From the mandrake roots that witches died for to the little blue pill that changed everything, we're tracing 10,000 years of humanity's desperate quest to control the one force that truly controls us. Phone away. Let's begin. In the beginning, there was desire. Before humans built the first cities, before they invented writing, before they named their gods, they were already searching for something, anything, to make the body perform when performance meant survival. We know this because they left traces behind. Sumerian cuneiform tablets dating back 4,000 years describe incantations to restore sexual potency, prayers to gods who controlled fertility, recipes mixing herbs and animal parts into pastes meant to be rubbed on the skin or swallowed with wine. The Egyptians carved their own anxieties into papyrus, the Ebers. Papyrus, written around 1550 BCE and one of the oldest medical documents ever discovered, contains explicit instructions for treating sexual ailments, including prescriptions for lettuce, which the Egyptians associated with Min, their god of fertility, depicted always with an erect phallus. In ancient China, texts attributed to the legendary Yellow Emperor and dating back nearly 5,000 years documented the first systematic approach to sexual medicine, cataloguing which herbs increased stamina, which foods strengthened the essence, which behaviors preserved vital energy. These were not recreational pursuits. They were matters of state, of dynasty, of survival itself. Consider what it meant to be a king who could not produce an heir. Your bloodline ended. Your enemies circled. Your legacy vanished into the dust of history. Consider what it meant to be a queen who could not conceive. You were replaced, exiled, sometimes killed. The pressure was cosmic in scale, and so every civilization, independently and obsessively, began the search for substances that could control the one force that seemed to control everything else. The priests held the secrets, the healers guarded the recipes, the powerful paid fortunes for remedies that might or might not work, but which carried the weight of desperate hope. This was not about pleasure. This was medicine. This was sacrament. This was survival dressed in the language of desire. The Greeks would eventually give this pursuit a name, drawing it from their goddess of love, Aphrodite, whose origin story contains within it the entire mythology of sexual power. According to Hesiod, the Titan Kronos castrated his father Uranus with a sickle and hurled the severed genitals into the sea. From the foam that gathered around them, Aphrodite emerged, fully formed, devastatingly beautiful, the embodiment of desire itself. The Greeks looked at this myth and drew a conclusion that would shape Western thinking for millennia. Seafood must be connected to sexual power. Oysters, with their briny flesh and suggestive shape, became synonymous with arousal. The Romans inherited this belief and amplified it to imperial proportions. During their infamous banquets and orgies, thousands of oysters would be consumed, shipped alive across vast distances to satisfy the appetites of emperors and aristocrats. Galen of Pergamon, perhaps the most accomplished physician of antiquity, who lived from 129 to 199 CE, and whose writings would dominate medicine for the next 15 centuries, prescribed oysters as a cure for declining sexual desire. He was operating within a framework the Greeks had developed, what we now call humoral theory. The body contained 4 humors, and health depended on their balance. Sexual function required heat and moisture. Foods that were warm and wet in their essential nature would therefore increase desire. Oysters qualified, so did eggs, pine nuts, certain meats, and wine. But the Greeks and Romans did not stop at foods that merely stimulated. They also discovered substances that forced the body into arousal, whether it wanted to or not. The most notorious was Spanish fly, which despite its name is neither Spanish nor a fly, but an emerald green beetle called Litta vesicatoria that secretes a chemical called cantharidin. When ingested, cantharidin irritates the urogenital tract, causing blood to rush to the genitals and producing what appeared to be arousal. It also caused blistering, bleeding, organ failure, and death. The Romans knew it was dangerous. They used it anyway. Livia, the scheming wife of Augustus Caesar, reportedly slipped cantharides into the food of dinner guests, hoping to inspire indiscretions she could later use as blackmail. This was the dark turn that would define so much of aphrodisiac history, the moment when substances meant to enhance desire became weapons, when love potions became indistinguishable from poisons. But no substance in Western history has accumulated more mythology, more fear, more reverence than the mandrake root. Mandragora officinarum, a plant native to the Mediterranean, produces a thick taproot that often forks and twists in ways that suggest a human form, sometimes distinctly male, sometimes female. The ancients looked at this root and saw magic. The Hebrew Bible mentions mandrakes in Genesis, where Rachel bargains with her sister Leah for the plants her son has gathered, believing they will help her conceive. The Greeks associated mandrakes with Aphrodite and Circe, the goddess and the sorceress, who both understood the power of desire. Dioscorides, the 1st century Greek physician whose work De Materia Medica would remain the authoritative text on pharmacology for over 1500 years, documented how mandrake could be used as a surgical anesthetic, a cup of wine infused with the root inducing a deep sleep that allowed physicians to cut into the body without the patient screaming. But the mandrake was also genuinely dangerous. It contains tropane alkaloids, including scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine, compounds that affect the central nervous system, cause hallucinations, and in sufficient doses can kill. Perhaps this danger birthed the legends. Medieval herbalists claimed the mandrake would scream when uprooted, a shriek so terrible it killed anyone who heard it. The solution was to tie a hungry dog to the plant, throw food just out of reach, and let the animal pull the root from the earth while the harvester blocked his ears and fled. The dog would die, but the human would survive with the precious root in hand. Whether anyone actually believed this, or whether it was simply a way to inflate prices and discourage amateur harvesting, remains unclear. What is certain is that the mandrake became associated with witchcraft, with darkness, with forbidden knowledge. Joan of Arc was accused at her trial of carrying a mandrake root as evidence of her sorcery. German folklore held that mandrakes grew beneath gallows where the semen of hanged men had fallen to earth. Witches allegedly mixed mandrake into their flying ointments, rubbing the hallucinogenic paste onto their skin and experiencing the sensation of flight while their bodies lay motionless. The church condemned it, the courts burned those who used it, and still the demand continued because desire does not obey laws or respect dangers. Yet while Europe wrapped sexuality in superstition and sin, the civilizations of the East were developing something far more systematic. In India, an entire branch of Ayurvedic medicine called Vajikarana was devoted exclusively to sexual health. The word itself comes from the Sanskrit Vaji, meaning horse, and Karana, meaning to produce. The promise was explicit. Follow these teachings, and you would possess the vigor of a stallion, the stamina of an 8-year-old horse, as one text put it, capable of satisfying any partner. The Kama Sutra, written around the 3rd century CE and famous in the West for its illustrations of sexual positions, actually contains an entire chapter on aphrodisiacs, on foods and preparations meant to enhance desire and performance. The ingredients sound almost innocent compared to the poisonous concoctions of Europe. Milk was considered the champion of all aphrodisiacs, particularly when combined with sugar and honey. Ghee, clarified butter, formed the base of many preparations. Ashwagandha, whose name translates to smell of horse, was prescribed for its ability to restore vigor. Shatavari, which is simply wild asparagus, was recommended for both men and women. Saffron dissolved in hot milk created a calming preparation still served to newlyweds in parts of India today. The 5-nectar mixture called panchamritam, containing milk, yogurt, sugar, honey, and butter, was believed to increase fertility and stamina. But the Indian approach differed fundamentally from the European in its philosophy. Sexual health was not separate from overall health. It was one aspect of dharma, of duty, of living in accordance with cosmic order. The texts warned that these preparations were not for everyone. Those under 17 and over 70 should abstain. Only a Jitendriya Purusha, a man who had control over his senses and desires, should consume them. Someone who lacked such control would become a danger to society. The goal was not indulgence, but balance, not escape, but harmony. The Chinese developed their own elaborate system, documented in texts dating back thousands of years, integrating sexual health into the broader framework of key and vital essence. The Persians and Arabs built on Greek knowledge and expanded it, writing treatises that would eventually filter back into Europe through scholars like Constantine the African. And so by the end of the ancient world, every major civilization had developed its own approach to the same fundamental problem. The body did not always cooperate with desire. Fertility was not guaranteed. Performance could fail at the worst possible moment. And the stakes, whether measured in kingdoms or family honor or simple human happiness, were impossibly high. The search for solutions would continue for millennia more, growing ever more desperate, ever more dangerous, ever more strange. The next chapter would be written in the courts of medieval Europe, where the line between love potion and poison would blur until they became indistinguishable, where women would burn at the stake for knowledge that kings paid fortunes to possess, and where the secrets of the East would arrive, wrapped in Latin translations, and transform everything. The knowledge came from the East, carried by a man whose very existence embodied the contradictions of his age. Constantine the African was born around 1020 in Tunisia, a merchant who travelled extensively through the Islamic world before converting to Christianity and ending his life as a monk at the great monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy. But it was what he carried in his mind that would transform Europe. Constantine was a translator, and the texts he rendered from Arabic into Latin included the most advanced medical knowledge in the world. Works by Persian scholars like Ibn Sina, known to Europeans as Avicenna, and Al-Razi, known as Rhazes, physicians whose understanding of the human body far surpassed anything available in Christian Europe. Among Constantine's translations and original works was a treatise called De Coitu, on coitus, the first systematic Latin text on sexual medicine. It described in methodical detail which foods and herbs provoked desire, which suppressed it, which generated semen and incited intercourse, which dried up the vital fluids. This was not the superstition-soaked folk remedies of European peasants. This was systematic pharmacology, drawing on Greek, Arabic, Persian, and Hebrew traditions, all synthesized into a practical guide for treating sexual dysfunction. The irony is profound. The very word Aphrodisiac, derived from the Greek goddess Aphrodite, entered European medical vocabulary largely through the work of an African Arab who had converted to Christianity and spent his final years in an Italian monastery, medieval Europe, which wrapped sexuality in shame and sin, which forced penitents to fast for years to atone for sexual transgressions, received its sexual education from the Islamic world, where scholars discussed pleasure openly and without the crushing guilt that Christianity imposed. Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher and physician who lived from 1138 to 1204, wrote his own treatise on coitus, continuing this tradition of learned discourse about a topic that European clerics could barely mention without blushing. And yet Europe absorbed this knowledge, adapted it, and then spent centuries pretending it had originated in the classical world, erasing the Islamic and Jewish contributions that had made it possible. The medical center of Salerno, where Constantine spent crucial years of his career, became the conduit through which Eastern wisdom flowed into Western practice, and from there it spread into every kitchen, every monastery, every noble household in medieval Christendom. For in the medieval world there was no distinction between food and medicine. Every meal was a potential treatment, every ingredient a drug. The humoral theory that had governed Greek and Roman medicine now ruled the medieval kitchen. Foods were categorized as hot or cold, wet or dry, and health depended on maintaining the proper balance. Sexual function required heat and moisture, so foods that possessed these qualities in abundance were prescribed for those whose desires flagged. Chickpeas were considered particularly powerful because they combined all three aphrodisiac properties. They were nourishing, they produced wind in the body, and they were warm and moist in their essential nature. The fact that sprouted chickpeas bore a certain resemblance to spermatozoa only strengthened the conviction that they must aid in sperm production. This was the doctrine of signatures extended into the kitchen, the belief that God had marked each plant and animal with signs indicating its proper use. Onions, leeks, and garlic were all considered stimulating. Meat, especially the testicles of animals, was prescribed for virility on the theory that consuming an organ strengthened the corresponding organ in the consumer. Wine served as the universal solvent, the medium in which herbal preparations were dissolved and delivered into the body. The Church, ever vigilant against the sins of the flesh, understood this logic perfectly and turned it on its head. If certain foods increased desire, then avoiding those foods must suppress it. Medieval penitentials, the handbooks that priests used to assign punishments for sins confessed, prescribed rigorous fasting as the standard remedy for sexual transgressions. The foods permitted during these fasts, spinach, beans, fruit, were deliberately chosen for their cooling and drying properties. Convents banned certain spices entirely, particularly ginger, cardamom, and pepper, on the grounds that they were too stimulating for women sworn to chastity. The implicit admission was startling. The Church acknowledged through its prohibitions that food could indeed affect desire, that the kitchen was a battleground in the war between flesh and spirit. Some medieval women took this logic to its extreme conclusion. Medical texts and folk remedies described practices that seem bizarre to modern readers. Women kneading bread dough against their naked bodies before baking it and feeding it to their husbands. The idea being that something of their essence would transfer through the bread and bind the man to them. Fish were allegedly inserted into intimate places before being cooked and served. Whether these practices were widespread or merely the fevered imaginings of celibate male chroniclers projecting their anxieties onto women remains debated by historians. But the underlying belief was real. Food carried power, and that power could be manipulated by those who understood how to use it. But food could also kill, and nowhere was the line between aphrodisiac and poison thinner than with the substance known as Spanish fly. We have already encountered cantharides in the Roman world, but in medieval and Renaissance Europe, this toxic compound derived from the emerald green blister beetle reached the height of its notoriety. The chemistry is brutally simple. Cantharidin irritates tissue, particularly the mucous membranes of the urogenital tract. When ingested, it causes blood to rush to the genitals, producing in men a painful, prolonged erection, and in women a sensation of pelvic heat that could be mistaken for arousal. But it also causes blistering of the mouth and throat, bloody vomiting, kidney failure, and death. The difference between a dose that stimulated and a dose that killed was measured in fractions. Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor who lived from 1050 to 1106, was known to consume Spanish fly at considerable risk to his health. In 1572, the great French surgeon Ambroise Paré documented the case of a man who had taken a potion containing nettles and cantharides and suffered what Paré described as the most frightful satyriasis, an uncontrollable and agonizing erection that would not subside. The courts of Europe swarmed with intrigue, and cantharides became the weapon of choice for those who wished to manipulate through desire. A carefully measured dose in a rival's wine could inspire indiscretions that led to scandal and ruin. A slightly larger dose could kill while appearing to be a stroke or a fever. The apothecaries who sold these substances moved in shadows, their client lists worth more than gold to anyone seeking leverage over the powerful. And nowhere did this shadow world reach higher into the light than in the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose reign was shaken to its foundations by what became known as the affair of the poisons. It began in 1675 with the trial of Marie-Madeleine Marguerite d'Aubray, the Marquise de Brinvilliers, a noblewoman accused of poisoning her father and two brothers to secure her inheritance. Her conviction and execution might have been the end of it, just another sordid tale of aristocratic greed. But under interrogation, she boasted that half the people of quality were involved in this sort of thing, and that she could ruin them if she talked. She was exaggerating, but not by much. The investigation that followed consumed Paris. Police Chief Nicolas de la Reynie uncovered a network of fortune-tellers, midwives, alchemists, and poisoners operating throughout the city, selling their services to anyone who could pay. Love potions, poisons, abortifacients, curses, blessings. The inventory of the shadow market was vast. At its centre stood a woman named Catherine Deschays Monvoisin, known to her clients simply as La Voisin. She was a fortune-teller and midwife by profession, but her real business was darker. She supplied poisons, conducted rituals, and according to testimony extracted under torture, performed black masses in which infants were allegedly sacrificed to demons. The truth of these accusations remains disputed, but what is certain is that her client list included some of the most powerful women in France, and the most powerful of all was Athénaïs de Rochechouart, the Marquise de Montespan, the official mistress of Louis XIV himself, mother of 7 of his illegitimate children, and the most influential woman in the kingdom. The accusations against Montespan were explosive. Witnesses claimed that she had been a client of La Voisin since 1667, that she had purchased aphrodisiacs to secure and maintain the king's affection, that she had participated in black masses where her naked body served as the altar, that she had attempted to poison both a younger rival and the king himself when his attentions wandered. The love potions she allegedly administered were described as containing iron filings, the blood of sacrificed infants, and cantharides, and witnesses claimed the king woke with headaches every morning after dining with his mistress because of the substances she slipped into his food. How much of this was true? The evidence was extracted under torture. The witnesses had every reason to tell interrogators what they wanted to hear, and Montespan was never formally charged. When the investigation began to implicate too many powerful figures, Louis XIV abruptly shut it down, sealed the testimony, and ordered that remaining suspects be imprisoned without trial. La Voisin was burned at the stake on February 22, 1680, maintaining to the end that she had never harmed anyone. 36 people were executed in all. Montespan was quietly exiled to a convent with a generous allowance. Her reputation destroyed, but her life spared. The affair of the poisons revealed what everyone had suspected, but no one had acknowledged. Behind the gilded magnificence of Versailles, behind the elaborate rituals of courtly love and the pretense of civilized refinement, lay a world of desperate women fighting for survival with the only weapons available to them. In a society where a woman's security depended entirely on the favor of powerful men, where a mistress could be discarded the moment a younger rival appeared, the temptation to secure that favor through any means necessary was overwhelming. Love potions were not luxuries. They were survival strategies, and the line between potion and poison was as thin as the patience of a wandering king. Yet even as Europe tore itself apart over accusations of witchcraft and poison, a new substance was arriving from across the Atlantic that would transform the very concept of aphrodisiac. The Spanish conquistadors who conquered the Aztec Empire in the 16th century encountered many wonders, but few fascinated them more than the bitter drink the Aztecs called xocolotl. It was made from the roasted and ground seeds of the Theobroma cacao tree, mixed with water, vanilla, chili peppers, and other spices, and whipped into a frothy beverage that the Aztecs considered divine. The very name Theobroma means food of the gods. The Aztec Emperor Montezuma was said to consume 50 cups of this cacao drink daily, particularly before visiting his harem of 200 wives. The Mayans had used cacao in wedding rituals, giving the beans to newlywed couples to consume during their honeymoon, believing it would enhance fertility and pleasure. The conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who chronicled the conquest of Mexico, noted that cacao was reputed to bring success with women. The Spanish brought cacao back to Europe and slowly transformed over decades as sugar replaced chili and milk softened the bitter intensity. Chocolate became the fashionable drink of the European elite. By the 17th century, chocolate houses in London were advertising the drink as capable of curing every ailment while delicately implying its effects on romantic capability. The chemistry offers some support for the ancient beliefs. Cacao contains phenylethylamine, sometimes called the love molecule, which triggers the release of endorphins in the brain. It contains theobromine, a mild stimulant that can increase heart rate and energy. It contains precursors to serotonin, the neurotransmitter associated with feelings of well-being and happiness. Whether these compounds exist in sufficient concentration in a cup of hot chocolate to produce any measurable effect on desire is doubtful, but the association was established and has never faded. Casanova, the legendary lover of the 18th century, reportedly consumed chocolate alongside his famous oyster breakfasts. Valentine's Day would become inseparable from the gift of chocolates, a tradition that persists to this day. The New World had offered Europe a new promise, a substance wrapped in mythology and desire, marketed as both medicine and pleasure. But as with so much that colonialism touched, the wonder was inseparable from exploitation. The cacao plantations of the Caribbean and South America were worked by enslaved people, their labor transforming a sacred Aztec ritual into a luxury commodity for European consumption. The pattern would repeat itself endlessly in the centuries to come, as substances promising desire and vitality were extracted from colonized lands, their origins mystified, their production hidden, their consumption wrapped in fantasies that obscured the suffering that made them possible. The medieval world was ending, but the search for aphrodisiacs was not. If anything, it was about to accelerate, driven by new sciences and new anxieties, reaching into every corner of the globe, pushing entire species toward extinction in the hunt for substances that mostly did not work, but that people desperately wanted to believe would save them from the terrifying possibility that their bodies might fail them when they needed them most. The modern hunt for aphrodisiacs has claimed victims that the medieval poisoners could never have imagined, entire species pushed toward extinction by beliefs that have no basis in biology but possess a power that no amount of scientific evidence can seem to dispel. Consider the rhinoceros. At the beginning of the 20th century, roughly 500,000 rhinos roamed the grasslands and forests of Africa and Asia. Today, fewer than 30,000 remain, and some subspecies have vanished entirely, the last northern white rhino dying under armed guard in a Kenyan conservancy while poachers circled outside the fences. The horn for which they are slaughtered is made of keratin, the same protein that forms human fingernails and hair. You could achieve the same biochemical effect by chewing your own nails. Yet rhino horn sells for more than gold on the black market, driven by a belief that refuses to die no matter how many studies debunk it. And here is the cruelest irony of all. Traditional Chinese medicine never actually prescribed rhino horn as an aphrodisiac. The ancient texts recommended it for fever, for detoxification, for conditions that had nothing to do with sexual function. The association with virility appears to have been largely a Western myth. A misunderstanding amplified by media reports that created demand where little had existed before. The stereotype of Asian men consuming rhino horn to boost their libidos became a self-fulfilling prophecy, a Western projection that paradoxically increased poaching pressure by spreading the very belief it claimed to condemn. The tiger has suffered similarly. Nearly every part of this magnificent animal has been assigned some medicinal property in folk traditions across Asia. The blood supposedly builds willpower. The bones are said to reduce inflammation and treat arthritis. The eyeballs allegedly ease epilepsy and cataracts. But it is the tiger's penis that commands the highest prices, prepared by soaking the dried organ in water and simmering it with herbs into a soup or tonic that supposedly restores sexual vigor to aging men. There is no scientific evidence that this works. The tiger is simply strong and virile in human imagination, and sympathetic magic dictates that consuming its most intimate parts must transfer those qualities to the consumer. The 16th century Chinese compendium Ben Cao Gang Mu, written by the physician Li Shizhen, catalogued these beliefs with the same methodical care that European herbalists brought to mandrake and Spanish fly. Li Shizhen was not a charlatan. He was documenting the medical knowledge of his time, just as Galen and Dioscorides had documented theirs. But those ancient texts now fuel a modern slaughter. Fewer than 4,000 tigers survive in the wild. The black market in tiger parts generates hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Farming operations breed tigers specifically for slaughter, their bones and organs feeding a demand that conservation efforts cannot suppress. Seahorses are harvested by the tens of millions each year for traditional medicine markets. Pangolins, those strange armoured anteaters that curl into balls when threatened, have become the most trafficked mammals on Earth, their scales ground into powders that treat everything from anxiety to cancer, despite containing nothing more medically active than your fingernails. The cascade of extinction continues, driven not by proof but by hope, by the desperate human need to believe that somewhere in nature lies a substance that will restore what time and age have taken away. This brings us to the question that haunts the entire history of aphrodisiacs. Did any of it ever actually work? The most famous lover in Western history offers a case study. Giacomo Girolamo Casanova was born in Venice in 1725 and died in Bohemia in 1798, leaving behind memoirs that describe in exhaustive detail his seduction of over 100 women across Europe. He was a polymath, an adventurer, a con artist, and a compulsive documenter of his own exploits. And according to his own account, he consumed prodigious quantities of oysters, often 50 or more for breakfast, sometimes eating them directly from the bodies of his partners in elaborate rituals of seduction. The oyster had been considered an aphrodisiac since Roman times. Galen prescribed them. Imperial banquets featured them by the thousand. Their association with Aphrodite, born from the foam of the sea, gave them mythological weight. And modern chemistry has identified compounds that might support the ancient belief. Oysters are extraordinarily rich in zinc, a mineral essential for testosterone production and sperm health. They contain D-aspartic acid and N-methyl D-aspartate, amino acids that studies have shown can trigger the release of sex hormones when injected directly into rats. A 2005 Italian-American study made headlines by suggesting that bivalve mollusks might indeed have desire-inducing properties. But here is what the headlines did not emphasize. No study has ever demonstrated that eating oysters produces any measurable increase in sexual desire or performance in humans. The amino acids that affect hormone levels in laboratory rats exist in oysters in concentrations far too low to survive digestion and reach the bloodstream in meaningful quantities. The zinc in oysters might support long-term hormonal health, but it will not transform a single evening. The romantic setting, the candlelight, the champagne, the intimate ritual of shucking and sharing, these contextual factors almost certainly matter more than any compound in the oyster itself. And this is the profound revelation that emerges from the scientific study of aphrodisiacs. The placebo effect in human sexuality is enormous, potentially exceeding 50% in some studies. If you believe something will arouse you, that belief alone can produce measurable physiological changes. Your heart rate increases, blood flows to erogenous zones. Neurotransmitters associated with pleasure and anticipation flood your brain. The ritual matters. The expectation matters. The story you tell yourself about what you are consuming and why matters. Casanova's oysters may have worked not because of their zinc content, but because he believed they worked, because the elaborate performance of consuming them was itself a form of foreplay, because the women he shared them with were drawn into the same narrative of desire and anticipation. This is not to say that aphrodisiacs are merely placebos. It is to say that the line between substance and belief, between chemistry and psychology, is far blurrier than our rational minds want to admit. The mandrake's hallucinogenic alkaloids produced real altered states. The cantharides in Spanish fly caused real and dangerous physiological arousal, but for most substances across most of history, the effect was largely in the mind, and the mind turns out to be the most powerful sexual organ of all. Then in 1998, everything changed. On March 27 of that year, the United States Food and Drug Administration approved a small blue pill called Viagra for the treatment of erectile dysfunction, and 10,000 years of human searching seemed to reach its conclusion. The drug's active ingredient, sildenafil, had been discovered entirely by accident. Researchers at the pharmaceutical company Pfizer had synthesized it in 1989 as a potential treatment for hypertension and angina pectoris, the chest pain caused by reduced blood flow to the heart. The compound was designated UK 92480 and entered clinical trials. It did not work particularly well for its intended purpose. Blood pressure effects were modest. Angina relief was disappointing. The project seemed destined for the pharmaceutical graveyard where promising compounds go to be forgotten. But the nurses administering the trials noticed something unusual. Male participants were reluctant to return their unused pills. When questioned, they admitted that the drug was producing a side effect, reliable and sustained erections. The researchers, led by Ian Osterloh with key contributions from chemists Peter Dunn and Albert Wood, recognized what they had stumbled upon. They pivoted the entire research program, designed new trials specifically targeting erectile dysfunction, and within a few years had demonstrated conclusively that sildenafil worked. It inhibited an enzyme called phosphodiesterase type 5, which normally breaks down a chemical messenger that relaxes smooth muscle in blood vessel walls. By blocking this enzyme, sildenafil allowed blood vessels in the penis to dilate more fully, producing erections in men who had been unable to achieve them through psychological arousal alone. This was revolutionary for reasons beyond the obvious. For most of human history, erectile dysfunction had been understood as either a moral failing, a psychological problem, or an inevitable consequence of aging about which nothing could be done. Freudians blamed the unconscious. Moralists blamed weak character. Folk medicine offered mandrake and oysters and tiger penis and prayer. Viagra revealed that much erectile dysfunction was simply a plumbing problem, a failure of blood vessels to deliver sufficient flow, a physical condition as treatable as high cholesterol or diabetes. In the first weeks after approval, doctors wrote 10,000 prescriptions per day. Within a year, Viagra had become the fastest-selling drug in pharmaceutical history. Bob Dole, the former senator and presidential candidate, became a celebrity spokesman, breaking the silence that had surrounded male sexual dysfunction and making it acceptable for men to admit they needed help and to seek it. More than 62 million men worldwide have now been prescribed Viagra or its competitors Cialis and Levitra. The pharmaceutical industry, recognizing the scale of the market, now spends nearly a third of its revenue on marketing these drugs directly to consumers, a practice that would have astonished physicians of earlier generations. After millennia of mandrake roots dug by moonlight and love potions mixed with blood and beetles crushed into powders that poisoned as often as they aroused, science had finally delivered what humanity had always sought, a pill that actually worked, that was reasonably safe, that required no ritual or belief or superstition, just a glass of water and 30 minutes of patience. And the supreme irony is that it was found while looking for something else entirely, a serendipitous discovery that owed nothing to the accumulated wisdom of 4,000 years of aphrodisiac lore. Yet even this triumph has not ended the search. Viagra treats a mechanical problem, the failure of blood to flow where it needs to go, but it does not create desire. A man taking sildenafil still needs psychological arousal to initiate the process. The pill enables performance, but does not inspire wanting. And so the pharmaceutical industry has turned its attention to desire itself, to the brain chemistry that underlies attraction and arousal and the mysterious alchemy that makes one person crave another. Flibanserin, approved by the FDA in 2015 and marketed as the female Viagra, takes an entirely different approach. It targets neurotransmitters in the brain, increasing dopamine and norepinephrine while decreasing serotonin, attempting to shift the chemical balance toward desire. Its effects are modest, its side effects significant, and its approval was controversial, but it represents a new frontier in the medicalization of sexuality. Researchers are studying oxytocin, the so-called love hormone released during physical intimacy. They are mapping the neural circuits that light up during arousal. They are identifying genetic variations that correlate with differences in libido. The $70 billion sexual wellness industry encompasses everything from pharmaceutical interventions to supplements to devices to therapies, all promising some version of what humanity has always wanted: control over the uncontrollable, mastery of the force that masters us. This raises philosophical questions that the medieval herbalists never had to confront. If low desire is a medical condition, what counts as normal? If we can chemically induce wanting, are we treating a disease or engineering human experience? The same debates that surround antidepressants and cognitive enhancers now extend to the sexual realm. Some argue that consenting adults should have access to any safe technology that enhances their lives. Others worry about the medicalization of ordinary human variation, the transformation of every departure from some imagined ideal into a pathology requiring treatment. The anxieties that drove ancient Egyptians to consult the Ebers Papyrus and Renaissance courtiers to purchase cantharides from shadow apothecaries have not disappeared. They have simply found new expressions, new markets, new solutions that carry their own risks and their own promises. Some conservationists have wondered whether Viagra might reduce poaching pressure on endangered species, whether the availability of a proven treatment might finally break the demand for rhino horn and tiger penis. The evidence is mixed. Beliefs rooted in thousands of years of tradition do not yield easily to pharmaceutical alternatives, and for some consumers, the very ancientness of traditional remedies is part of their appeal. A connection to ancestral wisdom that a modern pill cannot provide. The rhinoceros and the tiger remain in peril. The pangolin continues its slide toward extinction. The hunt goes on, driven by the same desperate hope that has always driven it. The hope that somewhere out there exists a substance that will make us more than we are, that will restore what we have lost, that will give us power over the one domain where we feel most powerless. We have moved from supernatural belief to neurochemistry, from magic potions to prescription pads, but the fundamental human anxiety about desire remains exactly what it was when the first Sumerian priest inscribed his incantations on a clay tablet 4,000 years ago. We want to be wanted, we fear that we are not enough, and we will try almost anything to bridge the gap between who we are and who we wish we could be. What does 10,000 years of searching reveal about us? Strip away the exoticism, the scandal, the science, the mythology, and you find the same terrified human beings in every era, in every culture, on every continent, desperately afraid that their bodies will betray them at the moment when betrayal matters most. The Sumerian king consulting his priests about potions to ensure an heir was driven by the same fear as the Wall Street executive quietly ordering Viagra online, the same fear as the Chinese emperor consuming tiger penis soup, the same fear as the medieval wife kneading bread against her naked skin. The specific anxieties have shifted over millennia. For ancient rulers, sexual failure meant dynastic collapse, the end of a bloodline, the unravelling of everything their ancestors had built. For women across most of human history, the inability to conceive meant exile, disgrace, replacement by a more fertile rival, sometimes death. The Aphrodisiac was never primarily about pleasure. It was about survival, about power, about maintaining your place in a world that would discard you the moment you ceased to be useful. Consider what it meant to be a queen who could not produce a male heir. Consider what it meant to be a king whose impotence was whispered about in the corridors of his own palace. Consider what it meant to be a concubine competing against dozens of others for the attention of an emperor whose favour determined whether you lived in luxury or languished in obscurity. The pressure was existential, and so every tool, every substance, every ritual that promised even the slightest advantage was seized upon with desperate hope. The Chinese emperors maintained elaborate pharmacies stocked with substances from across the known world. Indian kings followed the Vajrayana protocols with religious devotion. European monarchs paid fortunes to alchemists and apothecaries who promised virility and fertility. The Aztec rulers drank their 50 cups of cacao before visiting their harems. The patterns repeat across cultures with eerie consistency because the underlying human condition does not change. We are vulnerable creatures, subject to bodies that age and fail, driven by desires we do not choose and cannot fully control, embedded in social structures that reward fertility and punish its absence. The Aphrodisiac was always an attempt to regain some measure of control over a domain where control is an illusion. And this brings us to the most unsettling revelation of the entire history. Most of these substances did not work, not in any pharmacological sense, not in any way that would satisfy a modern clinical trial. The mandrake was a genuine hallucinogen, but not a genuine aphrodisiac. The oysters contained zinc, but not in quantities that would affect a single evening. The chocolate provided mild stimulation, but nothing approaching the transformative power attributed to it. The rhino horn and tiger penis were biologically inert, keratin and muscle tissue that might as well have been beef jerky for all the pharmacological effect they produced. Yet, people believed in them, people paid fortunes for them, people killed for them and died for them and drove species toward extinction for them. And here is the uncomfortable truth that emerges from modern research. It did not matter whether these substances worked in a laboratory. What mattered was whether people believed they worked. The placebo effect in human sexuality is not a minor statistical curiosity. Studies suggest it can account for 30 to 50% of reported improvement in sexual function. If you believe that the oysters you are eating will arouse you, your body responds to that belief with measurable physiological changes. Your heart rate increases. blood flows to your genitals. Neurotransmitters associated with anticipation and pleasure flood your brain. The ritual of consumption, the story you tell yourself, the expectation you carry into the encounter, these psychological factors can produce real effects that the substance itself could never generate. This is not to say that all aphrodisiacs are placebos. Some contain compounds that genuinely affect physiology. Ginseng appears to have mild effects on nitric oxide synthesis. Saffron has shown some promise in clinical studies for both men and women. The cantharides in Spanish fly produced very real and very dangerous physiological arousal, albeit through a mechanism more akin to poisoning than to pleasure. But for the vast majority of substances across the vast majority of history, the power was in the belief, not the molecule. Science has not replaced magic. Science has revealed how magic sometimes works, how the expectation of an effect can produce the effect itself, how the stories we tell ourselves about our bodies can reshape what our bodies actually do. The mind and the flesh are not separate domains. They are intertwined in ways that ancient healers intuited and modern researchers are only beginning to map. The placebo effect is not a failure of rationality. It is a feature of human biology, a bridge between belief and physiology that evolved for reasons we do not fully understand, but that has profound implications for how we think about medicine and healing and the persistent human fascination with substances that promise transformation. But belief has consequences beyond the individual believer. The pursuit of aphrodisiacs has extracted a price measured in lives and species and suffering across millennia. The witches burned at the stake in medieval Europe were often accused of trafficking in love potions, their knowledge of herbs and remedies recast as demonic congress, their bodies consumed by flames ignited by the same desperate fears that had driven their clients to seek them out. Lavoisin died in fire because she understood too well what powerful people wanted and was willing to provide it. The 36 executed in the affair of the poisons were casualties of the same collision between desire and power that has characterized this history from its beginning. The women who died from Spanish fly administered by men who wanted them aroused whether they wished to be or not were victims of a substance that promised control and delivered death. Arthur Kendrick Ford went to prison in 1954 for the unintended deaths of two women he had given candies laced with cantharidin, believing it would work as an aphrodisiac, discovering too late the thin margin between stimulation and mortality, and today the killing continues. The rhinoceros dies so that its horn can be ground into powder that accomplishes nothing. The tiger dies so that its penis can be simmered into soup that confers no strength. The pangolin dies so that its scales can be processed into medicine that does not heal. 500,000 rhinos have been reduced to fewer than 30,000. Tiger populations have collapsed by 95%. Pangolins may vanish entirely within our lifetimes. These are the costs of belief. The price extracted by hope that refuses to yield to evidence, by traditions that outlast their justifications, by markets that profit from desperation regardless of whether the products they sell deliver anything beyond the fantasy. Modern supplements flood the internet, pills and powders promising enhanced performance and intensified desire, many of them adulterated with undisclosed pharmaceutical compounds, some of them dangerous, almost all of them unregulated. The underground market in aphrodisiacs has never been larger or more global. The search continues unabated despite Viagra, despite clinical studies, despite the mounting evidence that most of what people believe about these substances is simply wrong. And perhaps this is the most important question to ask. Why, when safe and effective pharmaceutical treatments exist, when Viagra and Cialis and their generics are available by prescription and increasingly over the counter, do people continue to seek out traditional aphrodisiacs, natural remedies, exotic substances from distant lands? Part of the answer is distrust of pharmaceutical companies, a suspicion that their products are artificial, synthetic, somehow less authentic than remedies rooted in ancient traditions. Part of the answer is the appeal of the forbidden, the exotic, the sense that something rare and difficult to obtain must be more powerful than something dispensed at every pharmacy. Part of the answer is that Viagra solves a mechanical problem but does not address the deeper anxieties that drive people to seek aphrodisiacs in the first place. A pill that enables erection does not make you feel desired. It does not restore the passion that has drained from a long relationship. It does not address the fear that you are no longer attractive, no longer wanted, no longer the person you used to be. What people seek when they reach for aphrodisiacs is not simply function. They seek transformation. They seek connection. They seek to be desired as much as to desire. And no pharmaceutical compound can guarantee that. The $30 billion natural sexual wellness industry thrives because it promises something that medicine cannot deliver, a return to some imagined state of primal vitality, a connection to ancient wisdom that modern science has supposedly lost, a hope that there exists somewhere in nature a substance that will make us whole again. Some of these products contain compounds that genuinely affect physiology. Ginseng has shown modest effects in well-designed studies. Saffron appears to influence mood and arousal through mechanisms that researchers are still investigating. Ashwagandha and other traditional Indian herbs are being subjected to modern clinical trials that may or may not validate their ancient reputations. The integration of traditional and modern medicine proceeds slowly, hampered by methodological challenges and commercial pressures and the fundamental difficulty of studying something as subjective and variable as human desire. But most of what the industry sells is hope, packaged in capsules and drops and powders, marketed with testimonials and ancient imagery, sustained by the same desperate belief that has sustained this search since the beginning. Perhaps that is not entirely a bad thing. If the placebo effect is real, if belief genuinely shapes physiology, then a substance that does nothing pharmacologically might still do something psychologically, might still facilitate the ritual and expectation and hope that can produce real effects in real bodies. The harm comes when belief drives extinction, when desperate hope leads to poisoning, when the search for transformation tramples everything in its path. The story of Aphrodisiacs is finally the story of humanity itself, of our vulnerability and our ingenuity, our cruelty and our hope, our endless capacity for self-deception, and our equally endless capacity for genuine wonder at the mysteries of our own bodies. From the Sumerian tablets to the Pfizer laboratories, from the mandrake root to the little blue pill, the underlying anxiety has never changed. We want to be enough. We fear that we are not. We reach for anything that promises to bridge the gap between who we are and who we wish we could be. The substances change. The longing does not. 10,000 years from now, whatever humanity has become, whatever technologies we have developed, whatever we have learned about the brain and the body and the strange alchemy of desire, we will still be searching. We will still be hoping. We will still be reaching for something that promises to make us more than we are. The mandrake root sits in museum cases now, its legendary screams silenced by centuries of skepticism. The Spanish fly is banned in most countries, its dangers finally outweighing its mythology. The rhinos are guarded by armed rangers who patrol day and night against hunters who still believe that horn can restore what time has taken. And somewhere tonight, in a restaurant or a bedroom, a couple shares a chocolate, or splits a dozen oysters, or one of them quietly takes a pill before the other arrives. Not necessarily because they need it, but because the ritual matters, because the story matters, because we are human beings who have always believed that love is too important to leave entirely to chance. The aphrodisiac was never really about the substance. It was about us. It was about our fear of inadequacy and our desperate hope for connection. It was about our willingness to believe in magic when evidence fails us, and our stubborn insistence that somewhere out there exists something that will save us from ourselves. Every culture in every era has reached for something to help bridge the impossible gap between desire and fulfillment. Some of what they found was sacred, some of it was deadly. Most of it was neither, just ordinary substances invested with extraordinary hope, ordinary roots and beetles and shells and powders transformed by belief into vessels for our deepest longings. And perhaps that is the only aphrodisiac that has ever truly worked, not the mandrake or the oyster or the chocolate or the pill, but belief itself, the stubborn human conviction that we can be more than we are, that connection is possible, that desire can be kindled and sustained and shared, that love is worth pursuing even when the odds are against us and the substances we consume are just excuses to hope. We have been searching for 10,000 years. We will search for 10,000 more. The substances will change, the longing will remain, and somewhere in that eternal gap between what we are and what we wish we could be lies the true territory of the aphrodisiac. Not a chemical compound, but a state of mind. Not a molecule, but a mystery. Not a cure, but a question we will never stop asking.